did you find that these large organizations, like potentially big banks that you're working with, became more agile on the product side as a result of this? Like they started to get this agile concept of why the development teams want to do these smaller chunks?
I'll politely say no.
Darn.
I do see that vendors of software that sell their software to banks have gotten a lot more agile, or at least they're showing agility. But
Got it.
Right, I think there's a distinction here between folks who make software for a living and they're in the business of building software, and if it doesn't work or people don't like it, they're out of business and they go home and lose their jobs, versus big organizations that are in some other business, retail, airlines, government agencies. I think it's a lot harder for those folks to turn on a dime, particularly because for the most part, they have IT organizations as opposed to engineering organizations, and they view those IT organizations as cost centers. And so there's much more likely to be cuts to the IT organization than shifts in priorities that lets that IT organization do the urgent thing.
So the first part of the question was, did you get a lot of pushback on trying to move quickly or pushing out things on the roadmap that everyone thought was important? Or was there a community saying, yes, it totally makes sense that we should make these pivots?
For the most part, it was the second. It was the community nodding their heads, maybe even slapping their foreheads and saying, yes, of course, that's obvious. And either they thought of it or they didn't. But rolling out some small things that really help in the current moment has gotten a great reception from almost everybody I've talked to. And it makes perfect sense to push back some things which aren't as urgent in the moment. So I'm seeing customers react very, very positively to this. Otherwise, we'd be in a lot of trouble.
Do you have any advice for anyone that needs to pivot? Like if you're a company that's heading in the wrong direction, ready to pivot, what do you suggest there?
The first thing I always ask about pivots is, do we have enough money in the bank to get through the pivot? Sometimes we have some real optimism around how easy it's going to be to pivot. It's almost always harder than we planned. New customers, new markets, new problems, new features, new capabilities. If you're going to pivot, I would check the bank account first, because there has to be enough gas in the tank to get you to the next place.
So this comes from the audience. Early on in the conversation, you talked about outcomes versus outputs, which triggered thoughts for this for one of the audience members. And he's wondering, how does he learn more about that particular topic?
There's a lot of good writing. There's a great book by Josh Seiden called Outcomes versus Output. There's a hint. But I think the general takeaway, also Melissa Perry has a really good book called The Build Trap. Mike, I'll get the links so we can put them up in the materials. But I think the general trend here is you want to measure whether folks actually use your new feature or capability or product, and whether they get value out of it in a customer measurable way, as opposed to measuring whether we shipped on time. Shipping on time is fine, but if you ship something on time that folks don't use or doesn't generate revenue or increase customer loyalty or reduce churn or reduce support tickets or something measurable, then I think you're mostly in the vanity metric space, right? So output is counting story points and counting delivery dates, and those are handy from a development point of view. From a product management point of view, they're not really where we focus. If I'm shipping a new feature, it's because it's going to do something internally or in the market. And if folks are adopting it and upselling themselves, or we're dramatically reducing numbers of support tickets on a bad workflow, then we're looking at outcomes. And the best time to try to guess what the outcome is going to be for a feature or a capability is before you build it, not after. So if we've got something in the backlog, if we've got something in the heap, we should be asking the question before we start, before we spend the money, before we assign it to the team, what does success look like? How are we going to measure it? And then at the end, we'll do a retrospective on the metric and see how we did. We don't have to fire anybody, but we have to know what good looks like from a customer and external point of view, not just did we get a bunch of stuff done that we said we were going to get done.
Another question came in. So you talked about validating quickly as an important step. Can you give us a little bit of advice how you would do that, in particular if you have B2B type software?
Yeah, I think that's right. And B2C software in many ways is easier to validate because there may be thousands or hundreds of thousands of people out there willing to take a 3-minute survey or take your $20 to answer some questions. On the enterprise side, on the B2B side, you've got long-term committed customers. You've got much smaller numbers of them versus consumer products, and you've got to be much more sensitive about how you do that, because rolling something out that doesn't work is disastrous. And just asking folks if they like something, they'll almost always say yes, right? So I usually try to have my teams keep in their back pockets the names of 5 or 10 or 41 different customers that they respect the opinions of and really use the product, and that they could place a 5-minute call to or send a quick email to get a live discussion. Again, that's not a survey, that's not a check the box, that's a live voice-to-voice or face-to-face where you talk them through the problem and see if they agree that you've correctly identified the problem, and then talk them through one or more solutions and see if they agree that your proposed solutions actually address the problem. It's not scientific because 5 or 9 of those isn't really enough to put on a chart, but it's enough that if you're making a significant mistake, you'll have 3 or 4 of those folks tell you to your face that it's not such a good idea. Again, before we finish the feature, not when we're ready to roll it out. We're considering moving this around in the roadmap, and we think it's a good idea. Who are the 5 folks who opened up tickets with support to ask for it, and can we walk it past them? Maybe there's some diagrams, maybe it's just a voice-to-voice, but we're trying not to sell, we're trying to extract knowledge and find out if it's a good idea.
Yeah, that sounds good. It's in line with some of the things we talk about internally in terms of the face-to-face conversations where you get the real answer, right?
That's right, and it's a lot like what designers and UX folks do. If you show it to 4 or 5 folks and they can get through the new workflow more easily than the old workflow, it's probably better. If you show it to 4 or 5 folks and they all stumble, well, you didn't lose a lot. It may have just been balsamic or sketches or knock together some demo code. You can go back and fix it.
So there's another question here. It's related to AI big data, and do you have any? I think it's asking, are there any suggestions on what markets might be good to target for that type of product?
I've got a couple of really long posts on machine learning. I spent part of last year at 2 machine learning companies. It's the hot moment for it. It's at the top of the Gartner hype cycle. It turns out I worked on some AI stuff in the 70s when it didn't work, and in the 80s when it didn't work, and in the 90s when it didn't work. My caution is it's pretty easy these days to imagine machine learning working and imagine that AI is going to deliver a lot of value. Getting it to work is hard. You need real data scientists. You need large data sets and test sets and comparison data. And often the folks you're going to show it to don't know what success looks like here, so it's hard to put together success metrics. Really important to do that thing in advance and make sure that we have a plan to maintain the quality of the data or the machine learning over time. These things tend to degrade as the world moves forward and our data that we trained it with gets older. So when I think about machine learning and AI stuff, it's an ongoing effort. You're going to have a data science team on it forever, not just one time. And you're going to have good test metrics to figure out. There's always some corner cases we didn't think of, or some places where it gives the wrong answer. What's our escalation mechanism? So if a customer thinks that it gave him the wrong answer, they can raise their hands and have us check the work, right? It's going to bring a lot of wonderful things, but it's not magic. And it's easy on the sales and marketing side of a lot of companies to imagine that we can throw some data scientists in a room for an hour, give them a whiteboard, and at the end of it, somehow our product's smarter. It's way harder than that.
Another question here is, if you're in a startup, you're just getting started and maybe you started over the last couple of months or last 6 months, is there something you would do differently in terms of your product prioritization? Assuming your product's valid, right? Is there any kind of nuance that we should consider?
Honestly, I think it's very, very product dependent and market dependent. again, I'd go back through that same exercise. If you did a bunch of validation interviews and discovery in November, and it seemed like a really, really good idea at the time, I might pick out another half dozen folks who you didn't interview last time and do some extra discovery or validation checks to see whether something's happened in the world that you haven't thought about. We know that most startups fail, but they almost always fail for a reason that isn't one that the founders assign to themselves. They almost always assign it to a market issue, right?
Right.
Regardless. But go back, spend a little time going back over your notes from last August or whenever you kick this off, and think about what's not true. Call up a few folks at your target consumer or business audience. Get out there and do a little extra hustle, because there's nothing worse than shipping something that made sense last year and may make sense in 2022, but is dead weight here in 2020.
Really, do you think there's going to be a change in how product management works post-COVID? Or do you think we're still looking at the same things, same diligence, et cetera, et cetera?
I think there's going to be a difference in some of the products we build and some of the companies that we create. I think as a discipline, product management's pretty general. And we're going to apply the same product management concepts and approaches, but we're going to end up building different products or maybe even different companies because needs may have shifted, right? So I see product managers as primarily, the very first thing we do, and second and third and fourth and eighth, is we spend a lot of time with prospective customers and markets trying to figure out what's broken and where there's a need. That's maybe our number one responsibility. And given that, we're going to be out there finding out what new needs have developed and what old needs have fallen away. But I think we're going to apply the same tools, which is customer understanding and economics and working with our teams to spec out good solutions and trying to do pricing that reflects value. There was one that came in that had to do with there was one about certifications for drugs and medicines in regulatory environments, which I thought was interesting. So one of the questions was asking about that. Yeah, there's a certification called 21 CFR 11, which is something that the Food and Drug Administration applies to medicines and pharmaceuticals and hospital products. And the question was, is there any guidance for that, particularly around software as a service related to medicines and hospitals? And I think the underlying question was, we can't move as fast as other SaaS companies can move because we've got to get through regulatory steps, maybe. And I think my answer, which always is, it depends, is some software products are actually in the middle of the clinical cycle. For instance, if it's creating a new drug, and then you're going to have to go back to the FDA and get approval. But there's other software which is really in the business cycle. If you're building ERP software for hospitals, I'm pretty sure you don't have to get the FDA to approve changes to that. If you're building software that manages inputs from field tests and drug tests out in the wild, I don't think the software itself needs to have its changes approved by the FDA. So, you want to take apart your product, and if it's subject to those regulations directly, you may have to slow down and fill out a bunch of extra paperwork. On the other hand, I'm pretty sure there's some folks at the FDA who, if you told them this was to address a crisis, they might just give you a pass. It's worth asking.
So you mentioned earlier that most communities or those constituents were agreeable to making the pivots or changing the product strategy. What if someone isn't? Do you have any advice for that?
Well, that's one where my product managers kick that problem back to me because I have much more politically sensitive hands with customers. It's always the case that whenever we put out a roadmap, we have customers who are unhappy with it. It's always the case that, at least in the B2B enterprise space, every one of our customers has some things they want us to put in the roadmap which are just for them and they're one-offs. And so as product folks and as general software execs, we have to be comfortable with explaining our logic to customers and thanking them for their input, and then sometimes telling them they're not going to get what they want, even if they're the biggest customer that we have. If you can't do that, then you end up reverting back into a custom development for hire model where you have to recoup the full cost plus overhead on every piece of work because you're only building it for one customer at a time. I spend most of my time in what I would call the product business. And the product business is defined as we're going to sell the exact same bits to dozens or hundreds or thousands of customers without customization so that we can get up the volume curve and hit break even and collect money in the 90% margin category. As soon as you're doing a little bit of customization for each customer, you've got to rearrange the economics of your business because much or most of your work only gets used once. And so only gets expensed once, and so you've got to charge a lot more money for it.
Yeah, so Rich, what if it's an internal constituent? One of the things that I heard recently is that facts are friendly and opinions are interesting, but not relevant. What do you think about that?
Well, I know there's a lot of companies, and they tend to be internal users where the senior vice president of strategically making life miserable for everybody else gets to make calls because of some strong political base that the IT organization has to honor, right? And that's not a happy or pleasant thing to say, but it happens in a lot of places. It's important to understand where your direction comes from, and if it's true, walks down to your development organization every Tuesday and Friday with a new thing to put in the roadmap and fires anybody who says no, then I think that's your reality and you've got to live with it, right? As the person who comes in to run the product and sometimes product and development organizations, I think it's my job to figure out how to politely and humbly turn those around, find some political jujitsu so that we can get the right things done and still treat our internal stakeholders appropriately and well.